Good morning and welcome to our mobile master chat. I'm Amy Lensing-Tate with the UWM Alumni Association. It's been our pleasure to bring you these weekly talks on a wide variety of topics. Today we featured Jeff Turmel, the Director of Business Engagement for the Lubar School of Business. Jeff manages the Industry Connect initiative, a program that matches student and faculty projects to address regional company needs. Over his career, Jeff has worked in a variety of quality management, operations management, supply chain, and compliance positions in a career spanning 39 years and several major companies. At each company, Jeff was viewed as a highly valued and effective problem solver and developer of robust management and operating systems. Jeff graduated among the first class of Six Sigma Black Belts from Motorola University. Jeff also serves as the director of UWM Supply Chain Management Institute. He has taught in the UWM Executive MBA program since 2008, where his highly rated courses in competitive operations strategies and business simulation focus on teaching and sharing methods for organizations to become more competitive and profitable. With that, it's my pleasure to turn things over to Jeff.
Thank you, Amy, and good morning, everyone. Welcome. In our chat this morning, we're going to be really talking about the current and even some short-term and longer-term impending effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on global supply chains. Sure, I can, oh, there we go. As Amy mentioned, I currently serve UWM as the director of the business engagement, which really manages what we call our Industry Connect program. I just want to do a 30-second commercial on behalf of our current students. For those of you who are alumni, I know there are many relationships that we all help to foster in our relationships with the university. The Industry Connect program really attempts to match students and faculty with company needs for projects to drive improvements. And so we all know of the effects of the world being turned upside down the last 4 to 5 months, and the effect on our current UWM students has been significant. I would like to invite any of the alumni who may be thinking about a project as your companies come back online, if you're still currently employed, and trying to make some improvements or get back to business as usual in the new post-pandemic world, please reach out to me at jturmel@uwm.edu if you have discussions or thoughts about a potential project with which students can help you. The students only work for you for the duration of the project, and then they peel off your payroll and costs. And it's a great way to look at new talent. And we'll actually talk about that as one of the strategies that supply chain winning companies are doing today and looking for the future to come out of the post-pandemic time even stronger than they were before. So if you think Industry Connect project and potential use of Lubar students would be something you'd be interested in, please feel free to reach out to me. I also serve as the director of the Supply Chain Management Institute. That's the role from which I'll be talking to you today about what we're seeing from our member companies in the Institute and what we're hearing and reading from other major corporations around the world about their response to and their survival tactics around the short and long-term impacts of COVID-19. The Supply Chain Management Institute tries to reach out to local regional companies. We try to make connections between our supply chain students at the Lubar School and supply chain executives and companies who need that kind of talent. And we try to listen to company needs and trends to hear what's going on so that we can update and improve the supply chain curriculum in the Lubar School at UWM. So we're going to talk today about what happened at the start of the global COVID-19 outbreak. Very quickly, most of us know the general facts around that, but we're going to quickly transition to what's happening in global supply lines. What are we hearing and seeing about impending future supply chain challenges? And then really review with some of you what the leading companies are doing now to try to react to those challenges. So what happened quickly through the facts, you know, as early as December, and now we're hearing some folks talk about even mid-fall, spotty outbreaks of the COVID-19 new virus surfaced in China, particularly in the Wuhan area. Then into January, the virus began spreading throughout the country of China and also spread to Europe, mainly Italy, Spain, and France. and then spread to the United States, where the impacts have been the largest in global infection and death. We don't know the exact timings of all these, but I really just wanted to highlight that as facts, because it really starts to set up what happened in China as a major global supply chain player that started ripples throughout the world that we're still all kind of reacting to and trying to recover from. So what happened as China, the central government in China, began working to contain the virus? They began to try to lock down cities and did that to Wuhan as soon as they started to see massive infection spread and happening at a quick rate. Wuhan is a key global supplier, if you did not know, of medical devices, electronic goods, and other medical supplies and services, masks, gowns, and so on. So as China began locking down cities to try to manage and contain the spread of the COVID-19 virus, they started to impact companies' capacity and supply chains. And then in early February, they made a fateful step which impacted the rest of the globe, which was reported on a congressional research report in early April. And that is that the Chinese central government nationalized all manufacturers, both domestic and foreign manufacturers. So a USA company doing business in China would have seen their factory commandeered by the central Chinese government and being told how to produce and whether or not they could export medical goods and devices, no matter what their former business practices had been. That was a tactical step of the Chinese to start to direct and control medical supplies for their own use among their billion-plus population, but it had ripple effects throughout the global economy, which we'll look at. So if you're not familiar with supply chains, very quickly, a network of supply chains starts with raw material suppliers who then usually produce some things, ship it on trucks, boats, trains to distribution centers or warehouses, who then maybe do other value-added activities, transport that to then customer channels and to eventual consumers. And linked supply chains are particularly sensitive to disruptions, and the longer or more complex the supply chain, the more susceptible it is to interruptions and breakages. So as supply chains in China were disrupted or downsized or shut down entirely to control the virus, ripples of shortages started hitting global supply lines all throughout the world. As consumers then started to see those shortages and impacts, fear and panic buying would ensue in certain staple items and other products and goods, which we call the bullwhip effect. The bullwhip effect is a very common and well-known phenomenon in supply chains where small ripples start to then amplify, like the graphic on the upper right, and pretty soon you have wild variations in demand, from which supply chains rarely recover in the short term. You end up with shortages, and many of us in the US saw store shelves empty. Things like paper towels and cleaning supplies and even food staples like soup and rice. And my wife, as a bread baker, had trouble finding yeast for 6 weeks. So there were global shortages due to these rippling through these network supply lines that reached all over the world. So what are the current effects of that? Currently, company staffs are now just starting to reopen and come back. Many companies were working with reduced staffs. People were out with sickness and absences, and many people were working off-site. Factories closed, and even in the US, many factories were repurposed. Many of us have seen the news stories of Ford and General Motors being directed to produce ventilators, which they spun on a dime and did within 2 to 3 weeks. Now, stay-at-home orders are being lifted, but the impacts on US and global manufacturing supply lines and capacities have still been significantly impacted in the short term. And some product demands are varying wildly, although now it looks like our store shelves are starting to recover from that, and the normal stocks that have been in supply chains are starting to refill now that some of the wild demand buying and panic and fear buying has subsided. The result of all that is, though, that many global supply lines are in chaos. Production capacities are starting to come back online, but shortages, there's an old adage in my 39 years of industry that an hour of production time lost, you never recover. So those capacities that were impacted created shortages that it will take some time for certain supply lines to work through. Transportation lines, shipping, rail, trucking have been broken or impacted severely, and some material and product shortages still result from that. So those are the current effects of supply lines. I heard a comment a few weeks back that I love in terms of the impact of supply chain, and that is this, that it takes 2,500 parts or so to make an automobile, but it takes only one missing part not to make that same automobile. And that is really the effect that many companies have been trying to address and mitigate in their strategies to deal with the current climate of COVID-19 and the impacts in supply chains. So we've been talking to companies who've been trying to respond, and here's what we've heard many of our supply chain partners from the SCMI talking about. First and foremost, many of them signed clear communications authorities and channels, clear authorities and communication channels for their customers, and clear authorities and channels to communicate to their suppliers and partners and their employees. And those were not necessarily one and the same person or people. They were trying to make sure that the same story throughout their company and their supply lines was being heard by their employees, the right messages were being heard by their customers, and the needed messages were being heard by their partners. We heard many partners from the Supply Chain Institute talking about prioritizing products that they had in stock or not in stock, and prioritizing and allocating to key customers, making hard decisions in the face of shortages about who would get which products and services and who would have to wait until supply lines restocked and recovered. Many companies admitted that they were really focused on the short term. Let's get through this week. Let's get through the next 2 weeks, making decisions using kind of the 80-20 rule of 80% of the value often comes from 20% of my effort. And so where were their focused short-term impacts the greatest for their customers to help make sure that they satisfied the most customers that they could with the resources that they had. Many of our partners found themselves collaborating and supporting more actively with supply partners to keep their products flowing, sharing labor, helping develop or providing resources or assistance to supply partners. One of the worst things many of our partners at the Supply Chain Institute told us was the worst thing they could do was let or create a situation where one of their key suppliers went out of business. And so companies worked hard to make sure their products and services from their supply lines kept flowing. Some companies who were more avant-garde or more future thinking started working on ways to use data and technology to see more real time, artificial intelligence, better use of data analytics to be able to respond more quickly to issues and outages rather than wait a day or two or a week to find out that something had happened in their supply lines. So companies were trying to improve their visibility and transparency of their supply lines. And many companies worked with their customers to shape their demand, upselling or cross-selling to other products they had in stock so that their customers would maybe not have the specific product they wanted, but have a product that fulfilled their needs almost equally well. But the bottom line is that few companies remain undamaged or impacted, and many are still working to minimize COVID-19 effects. And we're finding that the supply chain leaders among our partners and the companies we read about in the literature are trying to come out of the pandemic stronger and more capable than they were before. So what does the future hold? Let me address that now. My crystal ball isn't any clearer than anyone else's. I spoke with a reporter at Fox News on March 5th, and we were talking about what if the pandemic got to be significant in turning the world upside down, and that has now happened 3 months later. So we do know that some and maybe many businesses will not survive the downturn. It really depends on the nature of the business they were in, how long and complex their supply lines were, and how flexible and agile they were in supporting the needs of their customers. But many supply lines in almost every industry will need repair or reinvention based on the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. And many companies are already, even working remotely and with reduced staffs, working on evaluating their extended and complex supply lines. Again, the longer and more complex the supply line, the more susceptible it is to various risks and effects of global pandemic impacts. A lot of companies are looking to adopt technology to proactively and seize control of their destiny, again, to see and manage real-time events so they can react more quickly and with more agility. And not sure other things that are coming, but those are some things we've already seen in terms of future challenges. The fact is that even though the pandemic has been one of the most significant impacts in supply chains in our lifetime, supply chains on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis are always attacked by labor strikes and shortages and weather events, and you name it. The pandemic has been among the largest in our lifetime, but companies are still working to try to manage daily challenges to their supply lines and creating value for their customers. I attended a Gartner Supply Chain Top 25 presentation a couple of weeks back. It was near the early May, where they announced the top 25 companies in supply chain performance. And they talked about the themes of what companies were attacking. And companies who were winning, even in these tougher environments and separating themselves from the pack, were tending to focus on three main sets of activities. First, they were actively managing supply chain strategies and risk. That means that they were proactively thinking and talking about potential risks in their supply chains, which might be different than another supply line or another product's supply chains. So trying to identify specific risks and issues that would impact them from getting products to their customers. They then began preparing plans to those triggers or events so they could start to prevent or at least reduce the impact of a possible event that would impact their own supply lines. And these companies are now starting to put processes in place to routinely break and reinvent their own supply lines. So they're continuously innovating and constantly in motion. That's probably the biggest trend we've seen among those who are winning. And if a company is not doing that, it's a tremendous opportunity for you to proactively seize your destiny, to start to take action, to think ahead about what could be going wrong and how do we prevent it. Second, leading companies were optimizing supply chain costs. They were choosing to optimize costs and return on small investments in their supply chain over cost cutting. The companies we think that are cost cutting are probably going to be among those casualties that don't survive the downturn. Whereas investing in technology, trying to focus on the weak points in a company's supply lines and improving weaker capabilities they had to react quickly to real-time events in supply chain, are probably going to separate winners from the losers. And third, even though many of us are working from home or working off-site, most companies who are leading and going to win the supply chain game are taking this time to actively work on their people and talent processes. They are thinking about job descriptions and reframing those to make sure that they can have the broadest and widest array of candidates for openings in their companies. They are broadening hiring requirements so that only necessary skills are on their search criteria so that they get the broadest, widest possible pool of candidates to strengthen their teams for the next quarter of the game, so to speak. And we heard those same companies who are leading and winning working actively to attract talent from their competitors. So they're looking to poach top talent from those who aren't taking care of their employees and people who are working for them. So by working on supply chain strategy, identifying risk, by focusing on making small investments in technology and people and process improvements in their supply lines, and trying to work on improving and developing their people during these tough times, leading companies, and the 5 companies cited as supply chain masters are some names we all know: McDonald's, Apple, Amazon, Procter & Gamble, Unilever. Companies like that were cited as supply chain masters who have cultures and activities working in these three areas to help improve their supply line performance, both today and going forward in the future. I think that's kind of a rundown of what's happened and what we might expect to happen going forward. And I will open it up for any questions at this point. So we have a question that talks about, how do we see Milwaukee's businesses handling this situation? Do we think most will survive? A lot of what I've spoken to you about are from Milwaukee businesses handling this situation. We have over a dozen partners here in the local regional area with the Supply Chain Management Institute, companies such as Harley-Davidson, Master Lock, Direct Supply, Rockwell Automation. And what I've spoken to you about, kind of strategies for short-term and long-term, are the things they've been trying to do to handle the situation. Do I think most will survive? I think many of the big companies will survive. Smaller companies with less capital resources will probably be challenged the most to keep their business operating and sustainable. But the companies who are trying to use this time to build capability and improve their operations, I think will come out of this relatively unscathed. I do believe there will be a significant number of casualties based on the COVID-19 business. And again, my crystal ball isn't any clearer than anybody else's. There will be casualties. But we've seen the winning and leading companies who are continually trying to innovate coming out of this pandemic, possibly even stronger than they went in. Any other questions? Have commodity prices rose unreasonably? Hard for me to tell that. Commodity prices have risen. If you've been to the grocery store, companies are experiencing greater costs in managing these exceptions to what were pretty stable supply lines. So companies have seen their costs increase, whether it's expediting fees, paying extra to get a carrier that they never used to do business with before. And companies are trying to pass some of those costs on to us as consumers. Are they unreasonable? I would imagine there is some gouging that is going on, but I think companies have tried very hard not to gouge their customers. If a company or provides a service or products and is seen by their customers as trying to take advantage of the situation, I think the reaction by consumers and customers of companies tends to be pretty severe. Commodity prices have risen really because of the exceptional costs that companies have been seeing. Hard for me to tell whether it's unreasonable or not, but I do think we've seen prices rise, and probably justifiably to some extent. Other questions? The question around what can smaller companies do to survive, and are there methods they could have taken to ensure their survival? I think smaller companies probably have to focus on their core value and really think hard about what value am I providing to my customers? What are my customers looking for me to provide to them? And really stick to that core. Smaller companies have less capital and resources to spend on extraneous kinds of activities. So focusing to the best they can, every activity on providing core value in products and services to their key clientele will probably help them survive the pandemic. Does buying locally really make a difference? I think it does. I think buying locally shortens the supply chain, makes the impacts less likely for a long and extended, complicated supply chain. Now, I say that when if I'm buying all of my produce in the New Orleans area and a Category 5 hurricane hits Louisiana, then my local supply chain can be decimated. But in general, shorter, less complex supply lines with fewer nodes in the network have less susceptibility to risks like this pandemic affecting them significantly. So buying locally does really make a difference, helps local proprietors, and especially in the small business arena, buying locally certainly can help maybe those smaller businesses survive.
That was our last question. So thank you very much for sharing your time and expertise with our alumni, Jeff. On behalf of the Alumni Association, thanks to everyone who joined us live today. We hope to see you on June 24th as we look at Milwaukee's long history along the lake with Margaret Noonan, Director of the Electa Quinney Institute for American Indian Education, and she's also a Professor of English and American Indian Studies. So thanks again, Jeff.
Bye-bye, everyone.